Muy buenos días, estimados hermanos y amigos. Una vez más estamos aquí con ustedes con deseo de saludarles en el nombre admirable, nombre glorioso, nombre sublime, el nombre de nuestro gran Dios y Salvador Jesucristo, el Señor. Esto es Sembrando con Fe y Esperanza. Bienvenidos.
Pliny the Elder, Gaius Plinius Secundus, was a Roman scholar and naval commander in the 1st century. His monumental encyclopedia, Natural History, was regarded as a scientific authority up to the Middle Ages. From astronomy to zoology to botany to medicine, Pliny wrote with precision, even including an index. His death occurred as he tried by ship to save a friend from the eruptions of Mount Vesuvius. Earliest manuscript, 5th century A.D. Number of manuscripts, 200 plus. Approximately 200 manuscripts date from the 14th and 15th centuries. In 1942, Hilda Butenwieser stated that she found almost 70 manuscripts of natural history which predate the 14th century. I. Thucydides' History. Thucydides, a Greek historian from the 5th century BC, has been called the father of scientific history. His History of the Peloponnesian War begins with an introduction setting out his criteria for evidence and analysis in writing history, indicating the intellectual influence of the great philosophers of Athens. Earliest manuscript, 3rd century BC. Number of manuscripts, 188. Sedapol's Merton's Pack 3 database, similar to Leuven, has 101 manuscripts from Thucydides. J. Demosthenes, Speeches. Demosthenes was an Athenian statesman and one of the greatest orators of his time, in part because he trained rigorously to overcome a speech impediment. His speeches provide valuable insight into the social, political, and economic condition of Athens in the 4th century BC. Earliest manuscript, 1st century BC, possibly earlier. Number of manuscripts, 444. This total combines information from Seeley and from the Leuven database. Seeley writes, Canphora, 1968, recorded 258 manuscripts of Demosthenes' speeches. He mentions that none of these has been dated earlier than the late 9th century. A Leuven database inquiry yields 210 results for Demosthenes that predate Seeley's number. However, only 186 of those are actual manuscripts and not quotations or summaries by other writers. 3. Summary. New Testament scholars and biblical linguistic experts Stanley E. Porter and Andrew W. Pitts observe, when compared with other works of antiquity, the New Testament has far greater numerical and earlier documentation than any other book. Most of the available works of antiquity have only a few manuscripts that attest to their existence, and these are typically much later than their original date of composition, so that it is not uncommon for the earliest manuscript to be dated over 900 years after the original composition. Caesar, Gallic Wars. Gaius Julius Caesar was a Roman general and statesman who changed the course of history in the 1st century BC wars that spread Roman authority over the Mediterranean and Europe. By defying the Roman Republic senators, who would have confined his authority to Gaul, he initiated the rise of the Roman Empire. He was a brilliant strategist and remarkably generous to those he defeated. Julius Caesar's name is recalled in our calendar, July. From 58 to 50 BC, Julius Caesar conquered much of Gaul and described his success in On the Gallic War. There are 251 manuscripts beginning from the 9th century. The majority are 15th century. For Caesar's Gallic Wars, composed between 58 and 50 BC, there are several extant manuscripts, but only 9 or 10 are in good condition. The oldest is some 900 years later than Caesar's time period. Earliest manuscript, 9th century A.D., number of manuscripts, 261 plus. F. Livy, 64 or 59 BC to AD 17, History of Rome. Livy, one of Rome's great historians, lived until the earlier years of Jesus. His History of Rome became a classic in his lifetime. It was a formidable and ambitious writing project, starting with the founding of the city and reaching the events of his own lifetime. His style influenced Roman writing for centuries. Earliest manuscript, 4th century A.D., Leuven, LDAB, ID number 2575-7402. Number of manuscripts, about 473. In A Companion to Livy by Bernard Mineo, there is a breakdown of Livy's works by groups of 10 books. G. Tacitus, AD 56 to circa 120. Annals. Tacitus, whose life was shortly after Jesus, was a Roman orator, public official, and one of the great historians. He was a man of great political savvy who studied rhetoric and prose composition. His annals concern the Roman Empire from AD 14 to 68. Historian David Potter notes, Tacitus' historical works descend in 2 manuscripts, one for books 1 through 6, another for 11 through 16, and the surviving portions of the history. Earliest manuscript, 1 through 6 in AD 850, 11 through 16 in AD 1050. Number of manuscripts, 36. Reeve notes that we have only 1 manuscript for Annals 1 through 6, and that 7 through 10 are lost. For Annals 11 through 16, see Malloch's commentary on 11, which says we still use just 1 main manuscript for 11 through 16, and there are 34 others that post-date this manuscript. The main manuscript for 11 through 16 is also Histories 1 through 4, so some of those manuscripts may be fragments that only contain histories. Everyone seems to treat Annals 11 through 16 and Histories 1 through 4 as a single work, so 2 primary manuscripts and 34 others make 36. H. Pliny the Elder, AD 2324 through 79, Natural History. B. Herodotus, Histories. Herodotus, a Greek historian from the 5th century BC, wrote of the Greco-Persian Wars. A vivid storyteller, he gave attention to fascinating detail. 49 papyrus fragments and about 60 non-papyrus manuscripts represent him. The oldest papyri date from the 1st century AD. Earliest manuscript, 150 to 50 BC. Many sources still say that the oldest fragments go back to the 1st century AD, but the Leuven database shows 1 fragment dating between 150 and 50 BC. LDAB ID number 1119. Number of manuscripts, about 106. There are approximately 60 medieval and Renaissance manuscripts. Sophocles, plays. Sophocles was one of the 3 great tragic playwrights of Athens, the others being Aeschylus and Euripides. Aristotle considered Sophocles' play Oedipus the King to be the paradigm example of tragedy and repeatedly cited it in his study of literary forms. Sophocles wrote over 100 dramas in the 5th century BC, though few manuscripts remain. Earliest manuscript, 3rd century BC. LDA bid number 3956 has a papyrus dating between 299 and 200 BC. Number of manuscripts, about 226. Lloyd-Jones estimates there are 200 medieval manuscripts and 17 earlier. However, the Leuven database, as of April 29, 2016, shows that the number of manuscripts before the medieval time is now approximately 26, bringing the estimated total to 226. Plato, Tetralogies. Plato has had a remarkable influence. Some have said that all philosophy is a footnote to Plato. Born in the 5th century BC, he wrote dialogues that probed the meaning of fundamental concepts such as truth, goodness, and beauty, which he argued were the highest forms of reality. His dialogue, The Republic, develops a parallel between the qualities of the best government for a city and for a person's self-government. Many of his works were compiled into groups of 4 called tetralogies. They provide priceless insight into Greek thought and into the Socratic method of inquiry. Earliest manuscript, 3rd century BC. Michael Reeve writes, 2 of his Phaedo are from the 3rd century BC. This is confirmed on LDAB IDs 3835 and 3833. However, on December 6, 2013, I, Josh, had the privilege of organizing an event leading to the discovery of what could be a portion of a 2nd century BC fragment from Plato's Republic. Verification of the authenticity of this fragment is currently underway. Number of manuscripts, 237. Nigel Wilson has kept an updated list of the manuscripts for Plato. In his list, 237 items belong to the tetralogies. Biblical scholar, translator, and textual critic Bruce Metzger, in The Text of the New Testament, cogently writes of the comparison. The works of several ancient authors are preserved to us by the thinnest possible thread of transmission. For example, the compendious History of Rome by Velleius Paterculus survived to modern times in only one incomplete manuscript, from which the Editio Princeps was made, and this lone manuscript was lost in the 17th century after being copied by Beatus Renanus at Amberbach. Even the Annals of the famous historian Tacitus is extant, so far as the first 6 books are concerned, in but a single manuscript dating from the 9th century. In 1870, the only known manuscript of the Epistle to Diognetus, an early Christian composition which editors usually include in the corpus of Apostolic Fathers, perished in a fire at the Municipal Library in Strasbourg. In contrast with these figures, the textual critic of the New Testament is embarrassed by the wealth of his material. New Testament scholar J. Harold Greenlee writes in his Introduction to New Testament Textual Criticism about the time gap between the original manuscript, the autograph, and the extant manuscript, the oldest surviving copy, saying, "Since scholars accept as generally trustworthy the writings of the ancient classics, even though the earliest manuscripts were written so long after the original writings, and the number of extant manuscripts is in many instances so small, it is clear that the reliability of the text of the New Testament is likewise assured." 2. Surviving manuscripts of selected classical writers. A. Homer, the Iliad. The epic poem The Iliad tells of anger and war, the final year of the Trojan War. Little is known of Homer, but the Iliad has been immensely important from the classical age, as its manuscript totals imply. Earliest manuscript, about 415 BC. The Leuven database records a direct attestation to the Iliad written on a piece of pottery and dated between 420 and 410 BC. Leuven ID number 130496. Number of manuscripts, 1900 plus. One of the top specialists for Homer's manuscripts is Graham D. Bird. Homer's Iliad is currently represented by more than 1,900 manuscripts, at least 1,500 of which are on papyrus, although many of these of a fragmentary nature. It is difficult to settle on an exact number of manuscripts of Homer's work because there are constantly new discoveries. Also, numbers used for Homer's Iliad do not include at least 5 in the Green family's collection, a number in other private collections, and 12 more manuscripts destined for museums that we know about. Martin L. West, Senior Research Fellow at All Souls College, Oxford, has catalogued a total of 1,569 papyri. But this is a papyri-only count and not a total manuscript count. Even though manuscript literally means handwritten, scholars like West sometimes use manuscript to refer only to non-papyri manuscripts. Papyri manuscripts they simply call papyri. More manuscript discoveries have been made of the Iliad than any other classical work, and yet the total number of manuscripts of the Iliad extant is less than 2,000. E. Comparison with surviving manuscript copies of selected classical literature. The Summary Chart of Selected Surviving Manuscripts of Major Classical Works presents our updated information for surviving classical manuscripts, with earlier dates now for the oldest copy in the case of Herodotus, Plato, and Livy, and with increased totals for several authors. These manuscript numbers raise challenging issues for skeptics because if they reject the transmission reliability of the New Testament, then they must also consider unreliable all other manuscripts of antiquity. As celebrated scholar John Warwick Montgomery has often related, some years ago when I debated philosophy professor Avram Stroll of the University of British Columbia on this point, he responded, "All right, I'll throw out my knowledge of the classical world." At which the chairman of the classics department cried, "Good Lord, Avram, not that." Glennie notes, "No one questions the authenticity of the historical books of antiquity because we do not possess the original copies, yet we have far fewer manuscripts of these works than we possess of the New Testament." Wallace concludes, If we have doubts about what the autographic New Testament said, those doubts would have been multiplied 100-fold for the average classical author. 1. A caution when comparing surviving biblical and classical manuscripts. One needs to be careful in comparing the survival and dating of an abundance of biblical manuscripts with classical works. Yes, we believe that God has superintended the preservation of such an abundance of biblical manuscripts. But there are good historical reasons for the paucity of classical manuscripts. Carroll comments on the importance of caution here, lest we draw the wrong conclusions. It is implied that an unspoken reason for the preservation of manuscripts is supernatural over against the loss of non-inspired works, but it is a bit more involved. Most classical works were in a region that could promise preservation on papyrus and were then recopied in Egypt and disseminated, not like the Christian monastic system. These texts were systematically copied and studied at the library in Alexandria, which burned partially in the 1st century BC, and then the texts were also systematically destroyed by Christians in the 4th century and Muslims in the 7th and 8th centuries. Christians are in part to blame for destroying around 1 million classical scrolls, and the fact that any classical texts survive in large numbers is remarkable. Centuries later, we often use the dearth of evidence for classical works to show the superior preservation of the Bible. Early classical works were written primarily on papyrus, a highly perishable medium, as was the scroll format. Christians quickly transitioned to the codex, book format, and to parchment and vellum, which were much more durable and suitable for the codex, and thus these factors hastened the decline of classical works. We also keep in mind that classical works were copied only if by chance by monks after the 5th century. They were left in the hands of the enemy, so to speak, to preserve and perpetuate, which they did, but not as aggressively. As seen in the chart Number of Extant Old Testament Scrolls, the majority of extant scrolls are not in museums but in ongoing use in synagogues or seminaries, and many are in private collections. Also, codices of Hebrew texts tend to be rarer and written later than those prepared with Greek texts. I, Josh, and my wife own 4 complete Torah scrolls, one of which is very old and very rare. We also possess 3 fragments of scrolls. None of these has been recorded or registered. The numbers and dates for the Old Testament scrolls, as well as the numbers of biblical and classical manuscripts and scrolls more broadly, are constantly shifting. For example, 9 small Dead Sea Scrolls have recently been rediscovered. They had been deposited in the vaults of the Israel Antiquities Authority, IAA. As said before, it is very difficult to estimate accurately the number of extant scrolls, but Scott Carroll, director and senior research scholar at the Manuscript Research Group, suggests the following totals. Number of extant Old Testament scrolls. Source, the Dead Sea Scrolls, number 300. Source, Green Collection, number 5,000. Source, Synagogues, number 20,000. Source, Museums, number 1,000. Source, Private Family Collections, number 5,000. Source, Codices, number 3,000. Source, Jewish Seminaries, number 5,000. Source, Individuals, number 3,000. Total, 42,300. 3. Old Torah Scrolls, Additional Discoveries, and New Technologies. As with the New Testament manuscripts, the Old Testament manuscripts, especially in scroll form, are being found and identified with earlier dates. In 2013, a Torah scroll created headlines. In 1889, an Italian librarian's faulty identification sentenced to archival obscurity an antique Torah scroll that has turned out to be the oldest complete such scroll in existence. This week, University of Bologna professor Mauro Perani announced the results of carbon-14 tests, authenticating the scroll's age as roughly 800 years old. The scroll, a sheepskin document that is parchment, dates to between 1155 and 1225, making it the oldest complete Torah scroll on record. Like all Torah scrolls, this one contains the full text of the 5 books of Moses in Hebrew and is prepared according to strict standards for use during religious services. The article continues, what a 19th century cataloger had interpreted as clumsy mistakes by what he guessed was an awkward 17th century scribe provided the very clues that led Pirani to investigate further. In April 2016, in a basement in Jerusalem, I, Josh, held in my arms a new discovery of an ancient Jewish Torah scroll carbon-dated at AD 1050. This will probably be shown to be the oldest complete Torah scroll in existence. One of the previous oldest Torah scrolls is a copy of the textual tradition called the Samaritan Torah, named for its use of a different set of letter forms and its addition of vowels, along with a focus on Mount Gerizim. Parts of the Abisha scroll, a Samaritan scroll in Nablus, formerly Shechem, have been dated to the 12th to 14th century, although the placement of letters in a particular column names its scribe as Aaron's great-grandson. It is written in gold ink on vellum and is fragile, mended, and rarely displayed. In 2014, an amazing total of 103 Jewish Torah scrolls, states Rabbi Shlomo Koves of the Orthodox Chabad Lubavitch community, were discovered in the manuscript section of the Lenin State Regional Library of the Western Russian city of Nizhny Novgorod. Koves said negotiations are underway with Russian officials to restore the scrolls and possibly display them in international exhibits. Rabbi Koves called the find he helped make last year of historical significance, adding that Hungary's government supports efforts to restore the scrolls. In late September 2016, a new technology of digital scanning was employed to recover text lost when a scroll had been reduced to charcoal in a burning synagogue 1,500 years ago. The scroll from En-Gedi had been known since 1970, but computer analysis created a 3D virtual unwrapping to allow reading the text without touching it. The recovery software offers modern applications as well as the possibility of its use to scan damaged New Testament manuscript text, once thought irrecoverable. Evidence that demands a verdict by Josh McDowell and Sean McDowell, Ph.D., continued. Disc 6. C. The New and Old Testament Manuscript Attestations. Influential biblical scholar F. Bruce writes, there is no body of ancient literature in the world which enjoys such a wealth of good textual attestation as the New Testament. In the chart, Number of Biblical Manuscripts, the second and third columns compare both Old and New dates determined for the earliest manuscript in each language. The 2 columns at the far right compare the Old and New number of manuscripts estimated to be catalogued for that language. For each language, the data labeled Old was tabulated in 2012. The columns labeled New show the data for each language as of August 2014, with the exception of the new number of Greek manuscripts, which reflects the official number as of January 2017. This comparison reveals the change, if any, in dating and numbers of manuscripts that have occurred in that 2-year interval through the discovery of earlier manuscripts in a particular language or by the addition of newly discovered or catalogued manuscripts. Current research continues to change these totals, and we must realize that every day marvelous new discoveries are being made. That is why the numbers of scroll and manuscript discoveries are out of date as soon as you print them. We recognize how astonishingly rapid is the increase of information and even the development of new methods to recover that data from manuscripts that had been thought to be forever illegible. D. Visualizing the number of biblical manuscripts. 1. The New Testament manuscripts. How high do you think the stack of New Testament manuscripts would be? Think about this. Of just the 5,800-plus Greek New Testament manuscripts, there are more than 2.6 million pages. Combining both the Old and New Testament, there are more than 66,000 manuscripts and scrolls. A stack of extant manuscripts for the average classical writer would measure about 4 feet high. This just cannot compare to the more than mile of New Testament manuscripts and 2.5 miles for the entire Bible. 2. The Old Testament scrolls. We have added Old Testament scrolls into the mix of the total numbers of manuscripts to represent the Bible as a whole and not just the New Testament. If you do not include both the Old Testament and New Testament manuscripts and scrolls when you compare the dates and totals of biblical manuscripts with those of classical literature, then you are comparing apples to oranges. The classical works, such as the Iliad, are complete works and need to be compared with the Bible as a complete work, not with just a part of it. In fact, the great proliferation of New Testament manuscript discoveries has been accompanied by additional discoveries of Old Testament manuscripts, sometimes as glued papyrus scrolls or sewn parchment scrolls, but also as single sheets and even as small fragments that have been recovered from phylacteries, the leather cases holding Scripture, to be tied to the hands or forehead during prayer. The Old Testament manuscripts not only enhance our awareness that many more manuscript copies are likely waiting to be found, but they help to verify the authenticity of New Testament manuscripts that quote them. Further, the scrupulous exactness that Jewish scribes devoted to their copying reinforces our awareness of the tradition in which the New Testament copyists worked, a tradition of precise care for accuracy. We get a glimpse of that climate of reverence for the Word in Acts and in the Epistles, for Paul had been trained in rabbinic scholarship, and Luke's writing also shows a scholarly care for precise detail and exact language. In the field of Old Testament apologetics, what has been overlooked in tabulating numbers of Old Testament manuscripts is the usage of scrolls and codices. Many worn-out scrolls were carefully copied for replacement and set aside, protected but unsought, and so never entered catalogs.
La Iglesia Pentecostal Unida Latinoamericana en Baltimore nos estamos reuniendo en la 8301 Liberty Road, 8301 Liberty Road, Windsor Mill, Maryland 21244. Y nuestras reuniones son los días domingo a las 8 de la mañana. Domingo 8 de la mañana tenemos el servicio de adoración, alabanza y enseñanza de la palabra de Dios. Venga juntamente con su familia y allegados. Serán todos bienvenidos a nuestra reunión dominical. Recuerde, Jesucristo es el verdadero Dios y la vida eterna. Primera de Juan 5:20. Y si otros días madrugamos a buscar la comida que perece, ¿por qué no hacerlo el día domingo para buscar la comida que a vida eterna permanece? Le esperamos.